introduce our first speaker. Richard Carstensen is a longtime naturalist, cartographer, educator, and several other titles that I can't think of, who has worked in the Mendenhall Wetlands for decades and decades. And along with Corin Bosworth and her Bosworth botanical consulting firm, they produced, at the request of the Southeast Alaska Land Trust, last winter they produced a new wetland map to replace the 40-plus-year-old wetland map that was used in the establishment of the refuge and has kind of been the management tool ever since. But things are changing quickly out there, as Richard will talk about. So I'm not seeing where he is at the moment, but it's time for Richard to come to the podium.
I'm not Richard.
Just that little podium thing on the... Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Okay, is the mic working? Last time I tried this, I'm told that nobody could hear me in the back, but I was talking in a bar, and I think alcohol makes people talk really loud, and we have this feedback problem. So raise your hand in the back if there's any problems tonight hearing me. My name is Richard Carstensen. I am a member of the Bosworth Botanical Field team that did this mapping we're going to tell you about that began last October. September, October is when we did most of it. But Ron also asked me to begin with a little background, a little history of all the research that's been done on the wetlands. You might get the impression, listening to some of the analyses, that nobody's ever looked at that place before, but that's not really true. Even for a vegetation geek like me, this is really the reason we go out there, is to see exciting stuff like this happening right in our front yard. And we might think of it as either a capital R refuge, the refuge that there's actually a line around on a map, or the small R refuge, which is what these trumpeters are really interested in. All they want is a quiet place to hang out and feed and build their reserves for migration, whether it's northbound or southbound. So we'll start with some of the prior work by us and by others. Then the bulk of the presentation is about the mapping that we did over the past year. And then what does that mean for the habitats out there and for wildlife? It depends on it. So our challenge is to get these things on a map. These are mostly elevational belts, but they're in motion because of glacial rebound, because of actual accretion, sedimentation from material coming down the rivers, and our ability to detect and pinpoint them on a map is also changing over time. We're getting a lot better at that than I was, say, 20 years ago. When the Canadian boundary surveyor William Ogilvie took this photo from the summit of one of those mountains with named after a guy whose name begins with an M, who I will not mention. There was not a cow track in this scene. There was probably still a few brown bears left, but the reign of hoots was not going to last much longer after this, and pretty soon it begins to look more like this. We actually grew local food for local consumption for quite a few decades. What a concept. And then by the time our friend Terry Schwartz retook that photograph 110 years later, even the cows were gone, replaced by jets and helicopters. And what we think of as the refuge, whether large R or small r, has shrunk pretty noticeably. This is what we definitely don't want to see in the same photograph. And if you want to actually measure that change in habitat over time, a vertical air photo is a lot better than those obliques that William and Terry gave us. So from this, we can actually start to quantify, and I'll show you some examples of that later. At the rate of 1/2 inch of rebound per year, the land in this photo in 1926 was about 4 feet lower. It's been coming up, and that's what accounts for that, mostly accounts for that change in vegetation we just saw. There it is just last year from photography the city contracted in, I believe it was June of last year. If you start to make historical series like these that I've been doing for close to half a century now, you begin to wonder if humans are ever going to come to their senses. It's just as constant as Matt said, that every year we lose a little bit more. And sometimes you need to try to make a map of it to really understand the significance of that. But there are some exceptions. This was just in the news in the past few days. They have been planning this for quite a few years, but in San Francisco Bay, they are breaching dikes to restore wetlands. And the director was the first one that got to go through. Ron, I hope that someday you'll be able to perform a similar ceremonial activity, but this is the last frontier, so that might take a while. The first good map of habitats on Taashuyee Chukanani, river or tide flat, and grassy land, sort of our two east and west names for the wetlands, was by Sarah Watson and the Department of Fish and Game, and it was very bird-oriented. And I have tried to kind of pick up those vegetation types that Sarah first mapped and continue that. My process is very similar. Jumping ahead here. My first environmental consulting was with a hydrologist who had left the forest sciences labs in the 70s and set up a business called EnvironAid. Dan Bishop was an amazing man to learn the ropes from. He talked really slow, but when he said something, it was worth waiting for. And thinking about Dan and EnvironAid in those days, basically for me, that was the 80s and up through the early 90s, I worry that what we call an environmental consultant has drifted. I have to ask what it is we're representing. Who is our client when someone pays us to do a job like this? Is it where the money's coming from, or is our client actually the land? The first job that EnvironAid did that I was part of on Taashuyee Chukanani was in the mid-'80s with Dan and Bob Armstrong. We were actually just subcontractors of a larger firm. We were asked to understand the eventual impacts of a proposed taxiway extension. Spoiler alert, they weren't very good. Dan was actually a very good mapper himself, but he pretended that he wasn't in order to help me carve out a little cartography niche within EnvironAid. So here's one of the first examples of a historical series, beginning with Navy photography in 1929. And then jumping to the aftermath of World War II, when we decided that poor Jordan Creek had to take a very sharp detour. And then hot off the press photography in 1987 is how I traced this one. Not long after that, Dan died in the early 90s, but the Fish and Wildlife Service asked Bob Armstrong and Mary Wilson and me to replicate a study that they had first done in 1986 in-house of where the major concentrations of birds were on Taashuyee Chukanani. And we spent about a year and a half doing that. Simultaneously with that, the SWCA, the consultant studying some airport expansion proposals, asked us to survey birds within the airport property. And in doing that for a year, Bob and I were pretty alarmed by some very illogical practices we saw. Even if your sole criterion is human safety, reducing the odds of a bird strike, we were seeing some pretty bizarre stuff, like cutting down spruce trees, which actually was a great deal for great blue herons. That heron sitting on the stump of a tree that was cut supposedly to reduce attractiveness of that area to large dangerous birds. Bob Armstrong and Rich Gordon spent a couple of years preparing a nomination to declare the Taashuyee Chukanani important bird area, or IBA, and you'll be hearing more about that later from Audubon. And in doing that, they wanted from me an estimate of wetland loss. So I approached that through mapping. And Matt gave you the figure about 40%. And this is where that comes from. And it's based on some pretty old methods. So I think we could, with all the resources we have now, we could do a lot better job of that. But you could think of wetland loss in 4 categories. The most drastic is just burying it, fill. And the opposite of fill is dredging. And dredging actually can create some pretty good habitat. But if that's right next to flight space, the FAA gets pretty jumpy about that. So those ponds eventually start to get filled back in. And then there's isolation of wetlands, for instance, by the construction of Egan across the mouth of Sitkuheen, the Lemon Creek Valley, or over on the west side, lawns and golf courses and thickets of invasive species. That would be more on the degradation end of wetland impact. And you add all that together, and that's about 40% of that black outline, which is what we started with. That was the pre-European extent of tidal wetlands. They went all the way up, way past Super Bear. And in the Sitkuheen Valley, Lemon Creek, they went so far up that where that arrow by isolated points to, there was an early homestead back there that the occupant could skiff to on a high tide. Diane Mayer, who's here tonight with the Land Trust, started to get concerned about the frittering away of public lands around the margins of the refuge due to accretion filings. And as part of what has been a 20-year effort of the Land Trust to stay out in front of that, she asked for an update to the Sarah Watson habitat map of 1979. So this is what we produced in 2003. My main collaborators on this were Terry Schwartz, who's no longer with us, and Kathy Hocker. And then here's what we got now. And it's way too complicated to even try to wrap your head around, but I'll show you some blow-ups from it in a moment. So by comparing that 20 years of change, using pretty much the same methods of habitat delineation, we can start to say, this is where we gained, this is where we lost. So that kind of brings us to, how we did this. Some of the people who have assisted with the Land Trust in making this happen. Thank you. You're looking at 90 years, more or less, of ground time on our local wetlands here. This is half of the Bosworth Botanical Field Team. When you add me in, that's 130 years. And our partner Andrew, he's a whippersnapper. He's probably only got 20 years of wetland mapping under his belt, but he's really fast. So when we needed to collect a whole bunch of photos way out there, we'd send Andrew out. So that's the Bosworth Botanical Field Team. And here's our study areas. The inner project area that we concentrated on mapping, 2023, is tinted blue. Then outside of that, in some cases, well, the official refuge boundary is in green. The blue on the north is what, for this Taashuyee chukanani being declared a globally important bird area, was not about the waterfowl that we're mostly thinking, but declining shorebirds. Almost every species of migratory shorebird using the flats here is in precipitous decline. And that's one reason it was agreed that this is so critical for our migratory birds. So for your bedside reading this winter, here's 3 recommendations. One very local in the middle, and 2 more broad scale and philosophical. Bob and Mary and I, with funding from the Land Trust, wrapped together our hotspots study and created this little blue cover book called the Mendenhall Wetlands, a globally recognized important bird area. And that's all sold out, but you can download it for free from Bob's website, NatureBob. If you had to read one of these, I would say read Crossings. It's just mind-blowing. It'll leave you with a totally different impression of what roads are doing to the earth. And then on the right, The Eternal Frontier is by an Australian naturalist, Tim Flannery, that talks about North America always being the frontier for invasions from elsewhere. He also introduced the term the future eaters. And the future eaters are the ones that show up on the frontier. It's wonderful to see you all here in one room, all you wetland lovers, and I hope we'll be seeing a lot more of you.
Well, thank you, Richard.